Hey, hey there, Zach. Reporting live.
Live from the office.
Yeah, looks good. Really excited to be here with you today. We're going to be talking about what someone like me, who's just a kind of a guy with a little bit of knowledge about kind of a traditional horizontally scaled web app, um, what I need to know to understand how to deploy, scale, and operate Fleet. Like specifically, how is this different from any of the other apps I might have worked with before?
Yeah. So I mean, it might help to start with what's the same as the apps that you've worked with before, and I think that the basic model of Fleet scalability is that it scales horizontally pretty much as you'd expect. You can put as many Fleet servers in front of the same MySQL and Redis instances, front all those servers with a load balancer, and essentially that's it for horizontal scalability. So we see folks running up to hundreds of thousands of devices connected to a Fleet server, so to a cluster of Fleet servers, that is really, with, say, when we're talking about that, it's probably some dozens of Fleet servers sitting behind a load balancer, and um, and then, like I said, talking to the same MySQL and Redis clusters. There's no additional configuration that you need to do. So really, as long as you're standing up all those Fleet servers with the same backend data stores, again, MySQL and Redis, then it just works.
So that got it. So I'm thinking, I got my Nginx kind of thing, and I got my little computes sitting there spinning, and I've got my MySQL and I've got my Redis. Now, is Redis just kind of a cachy data store, or are we using like the Redis MQ PubSub thing?
Yeah, so we're using multiple aspects of Redis. It ultimately, Redis does not store any data that needs to be durable. Any data that needs to be durable is stored within MySQL. So we can, we can tolerate a restart of Redis or a disconnection of Redis, but Redis is used heavily, in particular for the live query aspects of the system, because this is where we see the highest volume of sort of data transfer in out from the Fleet server and between. And this is where we see, data flows from the Fleet server to OS query agents in the form of what queries need to be run. And then data flows from the OS query agents back to the Fleet server in the form of results of those live queries. And then that data flows from the Fleet server down to the user client. So this would be either Fleet Control or the web UI. So there's a lot of data flowing through there, and so we heavily take advantage of Redis for doing that, because otherwise we'd just be slamming our MySQL instance with data that is mostly relatively ephemeral.
Got it.
So
Can I just a quick
yeah,
question, because I want to come back to the how it all moves around. But before we get there, so if I flush Redis, right, and I dump it and put a new Redis up, is that going to log everybody out, or are we doing sessions different?
yeah. So sessions are stored in MySQL. So what you will lose if you flush, if you were to flush all the data out of Redis, would be any currently running live queries will be halted.
Got it. Got it.
So all of the data that's already flowed for a live query is already sitting there on the client. So of course you don't lose any of that, but any query that was in the process of running will be lost. And so then you essentially, you just have to restart the live query if Redis loses all of its data, power cycles, or, for whatever reason you've lost all of the Redis data. Really all you is the current state of the running live queries. And again, we don't see live queries as like a very durable kind of data here. You might save the results of live queries somewhere more durable, but the live query state itself is not durable. It's live.
Right. Well, I want to get into the data flow. So that's probably mostly what we should talk about. But just to kind of like check some other boxes real quick. So thinking about our friend MySQL, like it can be MariaDB probably just through configuration alone. You don't need to fork Fleet for that. Right.
Yeah, folks do successfully deploy Fleet with MariaDB. We develop against MySQL 5.7, but plenty of folks do deploy with MariaDB. I'm not sure the version off the top of my head, but we don't tend to extend into any especially fancy features of MySQL, in part because the whole Fleet server and Fleet environment is designed to be easy to deploy on a relatively wide range of infrastructures, and so we don't want to start to get into the weeds in terms of compatibility.
It leaves the door open when we're a bazillion-dollar company to be database agnostic, maybe, or something.
Yeah, and the application code is architected with the data layer as an interface. So in theory, the data layer is totally swappable. And in practice, it's implemented only for MySQL, and it would be non-trivial to implement it for other databases. However, the architecture is there to implement it for any kind of database system, really, at all. But probably something that's it's certainly best tailored towards something relational, and it's certainly crafted with MySQL in mind for now.
Got it. And just for posterity, for anyone watching this video, it's like May 2021, so that MySQL 5.7 might change, right, by the time you're watching this. Probably not for a while. And then just also to call out, GitLab, $6 billion company at this point, another open core company, and I think they force you to use one particular database. So this probably won't be a thing for a while.
Yeah, I think realistically, it doesn't matter a ton to folks between MySQL and Postgres because both are extremely widely supported. You can get hosted versions on any cloud provider, and most medium to larger organizations have experience running both and are probably already running both.
Got it.
If you run only Postgres and that offends you, I'm sorry, and it's just where we're at.
Yep. And so thinking about one more thing about, I guess two more things about MySQL. So I have, we have connection pooling with the database from Fleet, right?
Correct.
Is that a kind of config that people ever want to change, or is that something that's just kind of like hard coded and good to go?
Yeah, so there is some configuration about connection. About the connection pooling with MySQL. In particular, you can configure how many active and idle connections there are. And so there's, depending on your environment, sometimes different connection limits are configured for the MySQL database that you're running. And so you may end up having to calculate to make sure that across all of your horizontally scaled Fleet servers, the total number of active MySQL connections won't exceed the limit on the database. Typically, it's not something that folks are having to configure very directly, but it is something that's there. And then the other, the other thing that you can configure is the idle connection timeout, which is again something that there can be different configurations on the MySQL side, and you probably just want to make sure that the Fleet timeout runs lower than the MySQL timeout. It's okay if it doesn't. Fleet will still detect that the connection's been closed on the other end, and we'll reopen a new connection or reuse a connection from the pool.
Got it. It won't just like trash. You want to end up with a pool full of trash connections if that happens.
Fleet may be holding on to connections that are no longer valid, and may not know until it tries to use those connections. But the fact that it's trying to use connections that are no longer valid should not ultimately cause operational issues for Fleet. It should be able to detect those and recover.
Awesome. Got it. Well, and that's a relief. So those are pretty standard kind of database things that I'm used to hearing about apps like this. So that's good. And then as far as, in Redis, I think we're using it for some caching as well, right? Besides just for sending messages around, or is it really just for like sending messages around?
Yeah, so we use it, you could call it caching. We use it for storing the information about the state of live queries within Fleet. So, for example, you have to imagine when we have tens of thousands of hosts and they're checking in on an interval of something like every 10 seconds or maybe every 30 seconds or every minute. That's a lot of requests from hosts saying, do you have any live queries for me to run? If we're hitting the database for all of those, it could end up being a relatively expensive MySQL query to do all of that, and it's also just really high throughput query because of how many clients there are and how often they check for these things. So we've pushed the information about which clients need to run which queries into Redis, and this ends up being extremely efficient, takes a ton of load off the MySQL database, and this becomes even like managing live query for like over 100,000 hosts is like something that you can run on like a 1 core 500 megabytes of RAM Redis machine.
Got it. Okay, that's great to hear. And then actually, so similar about MySQL, do you remember offhand what kind of like, if I'm using like a hosted MySQL, like what would I expect to like pay per month for a Fleet install for, I don't know, I got like 50,000 hosts or 20,000 hosts, something like that?
I'm not sure. I definitely don't remember pricing off the top of my head, but let's say you've got 20,000 hosts. I think you get away fine with a small to medium sized instance on most cloud providers. And if you're getting up around 100,000 hosts, then you're gonna be probably looking at like an XL instance, and those run fairly pricey. But if you've got hundreds of thousands of hosts, I think that's going to end up looking like a pretty manageable cost for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, and the reason why that is because Fleet's not durably storing the results from these scheduled queries.
Right. Fleet stores information about which scheduled queries have run and which ones need to run so that we can generate configurations for OS query clients when they come in. But Fleet doesn't store per se the results of scheduled queries. Those get pushed into logging pipelines and end up in data stores that are better suited to these massive amounts of relatively unstructured data.
Lakes and ETL things like this. Yes. Okay.
Right. These kind of things, or your Splunk Elasticsearch, this kind of thing.
Right. Got it. And then when we talk about schedule, just so to help someone who maybe isn't as familiar with the term schedule query for us, we're not talking about like a cron, right? So actually Fleet, as of today in May 2021,